He stands in the center of the square, a hood over his head, a crowd screaming for blood, and in his hands, the blade that decides who lives and who dies. In the Middle Ages, the executioner was not just a killer. He was a symbol of fear, of power, and of divine justice. He lived apart from everyone else, feared by peasants, cursed by priests, and paid by kings. His work was dirty but necessary, and behind every public execution there was a ritual, precise, brutal, and sacred. But what did these men actually do? How did they live? And what happened to them when their hands were finally clean, but their souls were not? Before we lift the hood on this story, do one thing for me. Hit the like button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these dark tales travel across the world, and if you haven't yet, subscribe. Because here, history isn't just told, it bleeds. In the Middle Ages, the executioner stood at the edge of every town, both feared and needed. He was the shadow of the law, the living reminder that justice had a face, and it wore a hood. Executioners were not born into their trade. They were chosen or condemned into it. Sometimes a prisoner was offered freedom if he agreed to take the job. Sometimes the son of a dead executioner had no choice but to inherit his father's blade. It was a profession no one wanted, yet society could not exist without it. To the church, death was purification. To the king, it was order. To the people, it was entertainment and a warning. The executioner stood in the middle of those worlds, a man both servant and sinner, hated by the very crowd that came to watch his work. He lived apart from others, often in a house by the city gate, near the gallows or the river. No one wanted to touch him, to trade with him, or even to look him in the eye. His coins were marked, his food refused. Children were told that shaking his hand would bring bad luck. And yet, when justice was needed, it was his hand they called. Every town needed one. From the smallest village to the greatest city, someone had to swing the sword, tighten the rope, or light the fire. It was considered divine duty, not by the executioner, but by those who ordered him. His blade was the extension of royal will, and his strength was the visible proof of authority. But he was not just a killer, he was also the keeper of law. Executioners carried out corporal punishments, amputations, branding, flogging. They prepared prisoners for death, cleaned the tools, and sometimes even disposed of the bodies. When torture was authorized by the court, it was his hands that turned the wheel or pulled the rope, always under the priest's supervision, so that faith and pain worked together. Despite their isolation, some executioners became powerful. A few were skilled enough to earn respect, even wealth. They were paid per act, sometimes receiving extra for mercy kills, when they could make the execution quick and clean. Others collected the belongings of the condemned as part of their fee. Some even ran side businesses, tanning hides, butchering animals, or disposing of carcasses, trades that, like execution, involved death. Still, no amount of money could wash the stain. To touch the hangman was to invite misfortune. To dine with him was to risk your soul. He belonged to no one, yet everyone belonged to his work. In a world ruled by sin and salvation, he was the instrument of fear that kept order alive. And though his face was hidden beneath a hood, everyone knew his name, whispered it when the bell tolled, and prayed never to meet him at dawn. Because in the Middle Ages, the executioner wasn't just a man. He was justice given flesh. Every execution in the Middle Ages was more than punishment. It was a message, a theater of fear meant to remind everyone that sin had a price and that justice came not from mercy, but from pain. The most common form of death was hanging. It was cheap, simple, and public. For thieves, deserters, and common criminals, the rope was the end of the road. Executioners often built gallows at crossroads or city gates, places where the body would hang for days, left as a warning to all who passed. Crows, flies, and time finished the lesson that the rope began, and yet hanging was seen as the merciful death, quick if the neck broke clean. For nobility, the preferred method was beheading. The sword or the axe was a privilege reserved for those of status. It was faster, cleaner, and, in theory, more honorable. But a bad swing could turn dignity into disaster. A dull blade or a trembling hand meant agony. Some executioners practiced on animals the night before an important job, praying for precision. A single strike could earn them gold, a mistake, the crowd's rage. Then there was burning, reserved for heretics, witches, and those who defied the church. It was not simply death, but purification through fire. Flames consumed both flesh and sin. Priests read prayers while the condemned screamed, their voices rising with the smoke. To the crowd, it was divine justice made visible. To the victim, it was hell brought to earth. Drowning was another method, quieter but no less symbolic. It was used for women accused of witchcraft or infanticide, crimes seen as unnatural. The water was supposed to judge them. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but dead. A cruel irony disguised as divine proof. For traitors and enemies of the crown, death came through dismemberment. Drawn and quartered, their limbs nailed to gates, their heads displayed on spikes. Each piece of the body told a story, of betrayal and of the king's power. It was not only punishment, it was propaganda. Even torture had ritual meaning. It was not chaos but order, a process meant to extract confession and cleanse the soul before death. The wheel, the rack, the iron boots, each was applied under legal authority, not rage. Pain was law, and the executioner, its priest. Crowds gathered for these events as if attending theatre. Vendors sold food and ale, children sat on their fathers' shoulders, and chroniclers recorded every detail. When the blade fell, the cheers rose. The condemned was gone, but the people felt safer, cleaner, forgiven. For them, witnessing punishment was an act of faith. In every city square, blood became the ink of justice. The executioner, faceless behind his hood, was both artist and messenger, shaping the boundary between sin and salvation, between the living and the damned. The executioner was always alone. He could stand in the middle of a cheering crowd and still feel invisible, or worse, cursed. No one wanted to live near him. His house was usually built on the edge of town near the gallows, where the smell of death mixed with smoke and damp earth. Children crossed the street when they saw him. Merchants refused his coins. And yet, when someone needed a wound stitched or an animal put down, they came knocking at his door, always at night, always in silence. He lived between worlds, too sinful for the church, too necessary for the king. He served both and belonged to neither. His touch was believed to carry evil, but also power. Some villagers secretly collected shavings of his rope or drops of blood from his tools, thinking they had magic to heal or curse. Even in fear, the people could not escape their fascination with him, but the executioner could not escape himself. Many drank heavily, seeking to silence the memories. Some turned to prayer, building small shrines in their homes to beg forgiveness for every neck they broke, every cry they silenced. Others grew numb, the face behind the hood becoming a mask of apathy, a shell protecting what little humanity remained. They were paid well, but wealth meant nothing when you could not share a meal with your neighbors. Some married only other outcasts, widows, prostitutes, or the daughters of fellow executioners. Their children inherited both the trade and the curse, trapped in a lineage of death that stretched for generations. There were moments of guilt, flashes of faces that would not fade. Men who prayed for mercy, women who cried for their children. In their dreams, the executioners often saw them all again, not as victims, but as ghosts waiting, whispering. Chroniclers wrote that some executioners wept after their work. Others vomited, unable to eat for days. A few became obsessed with precision, measuring each swing, each drop of blood, as if perfection could make forgiveness possible. But no matter how clean the cut, the weight of sin never left them. In many cities, executioners were forbidden to enter churches or marketplaces. They had their own wells, their own cemeteries. Even in death, they remained apart. Some were buried at crossroads, so their souls, like their bodies, would never rest in one place. Still, there were rare moments of respect. When an execution was swift and dignified, the crowd sometimes applauded. Her clean death was seen as a sign of skill, almost mercy. And for a brief moment the executioner could feel human again. But it never lasted. The next morning he was once more the untouchable hand of justice. a man whose life was defined by other people's endings. He carried their screams in silence. He lived with their eyes in his memory. And no matter how many fires he lit or heads he raised to the crowd, one truth haunted him always. He was not killing for himself. He was killing for all of them. When the time came for an execution, it was never quiet. It was an event, part justice, part theatre, and part prayer. Days before, rumors spread through the town. Children whispered, merchants prepared, and travelers arrived from nearby villages. For many, it was the only public entertainment they would ever see. Bells tolled in the morning, calling the faithful and the curious alike. By noon, the square was full. Ale vendors shouted, dogs barked, and people climbed rooftops for a better view. And in the center, the scaffold waited. The executioner prepared it himself, every rope, every blade, every nail in place. The tools were sacred to him, not because they were holy, but because they were perfect. He tested the trapdoor, sharpened the axe, adjusted the rope's length for the victim's height. If the knot was too short, the condemned would choke slowly. Too long and the head might tear free. Precision was mercy. When the prisoner was brought out, the noise changed. The crowd that had been laughing grew silent. The condemned was made to kneel, confess, and face the priest. Sometimes they forgave the executioner, believing that dying without hate might help their soul rise faster. Sometimes they spat at him instead. The church played its part, too. Priests walked beside the condemned, chanting prayers for the soul's salvation. They told the crowd that justice was God's will, that sin had to be burned away with pain. The scaffold became an altar. The executioner, its priest. Every stroke, every cry, every drop of blood was meant to balance the scales between heaven and earth. When the final moment came, the air grew still. The executioner raised his blade or signaled the hangman's lever. For a heartbeat, even the wind held its breath. And then the crowd erupted, in gasps, in cheers, in prayers. The line between horror and devotion disappeared. Children were told to watch, to learn what disobedience meant. Parents lifted them on their shoulders so they could see the lesson clearly. Sin ends here. Vendors sold bits of rope or wood from the scaffold as charms against evil. Some even dipped handkerchiefs in the victim's blood, believing it carried power. Afterward, the body was left hanging or displayed. Heads were set on spikes, hands nailed to gates. The smell of iron and decay filled the streets. For days the people would pass by, crossing themselves or whispering prayers. The execution became part of the city's rhythm, a cycle of sin, punishment, and cleansing. And the executioner? He cleaned his tools, washed the blood from his hands, and walked home alone. No applause, no honor, just the silence that followed after every scream. To the medieval mind, justice was not about mercy. It was about order. Pain was not cruelty, it was necessity. And in that square, where thousands gathered to see one man die, society saw itself reflected, brutal, faithful, and certain that suffering was the will of God. As the centuries passed, the medieval world began to change, but the executioner did not. He remained, blade in hand, as kings fell, churches divided, and cities rose from mud into stone. Only his tools evolved. The axe became sharper, the rope stronger, and eventually the sword gave way to the machine. By the Renaissance, some began to question whether public death truly brought justice. Philosophers whispered of morality. Doctors studied the body and found that pain taught nothing. But the crowd was not ready to let go. For hundreds of years they still gathered, drawn by the same ancient hunger, the need to see sin punished, to see evil end with a sound and a scream. The executioner's work became more precise, more technical. In France, the guillotine was invented to humanize death. It was said to be merciful, quick, clean, equal for all. But behind that invention was the same logic that ruled the Middle Ages: control through fear. The hood stayed. The silence after the blade fell stayed. Only the costume of justice changed. By the 18th century, the executioner's line began to die out. Some families, whose ancestors had held the title for generations, tried to hide it. Their children changed surnames, moved to cities, learned new trades. But the stigma followed them. Even centuries later, the blood of the hangman could not be washed away by time. Public executions were slowly banned across Europe. The last gallows were taken down, the last crowds dispersed. The scaffold, once the heart of civic life, was replaced by the courtroom, by laws written on paper instead of blood. But the fascination with death did not disappear. It simply moved, from the town square to the page to the stage to the screen. We still gather around stories of justice and vengeance. We still crave the line between good and evil, the punishment and the release. We no longer cheer the blade, but we watch it in silence. And though the executioner is gone, his ghost remains. In every prison, in every government that kills in the name of order, in every person who believes that pain is the only path to truth. His hood became a symbol of authority, secrecy, and guilt. His rope became history, but his shadow stretches into our time, reminding us that civilization did not erase cruelty, it only gave it rules. The medieval executioner may have vanished from the scaffold, but not from the human heart, because the same instinct that once filled those squares, fear, judgment, and fascination with death, still lives in us. And in that sense, his blade never really stopped falling. So now you know the truth. The executioner was not a monster. He was a man trapped in a world that demanded monsters to survive. He stood between justice and sin, between fear and faith. And every time his blade fell, it wasn't just one life that ended. It was a ritual, one that kept an entire society from collapsing into chaos. They called it law, they called it order. But behind the masks, behind the chants and the prayers, it was still just death, served cold, clean, and public. Centuries later, the hood is gone, the scaffold is silent, yet the instinct remains, the need to see punishment, the hunger for justice through pain. It's part of who we are, written deep into our history, carved into the stone of every city that once raised a gallows. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video with another strange, shocking, and crazy chapter from the Dark Ages.